screen. Let's all stay on mute. Okay, so I'm picking up on chapter 4. All right. Chapter 4. John had the bad habit of chewing things when he was thinking hard. This morning, he had several things to think about. What had made the toothpaste taste like chocolate? What had made the orange juice taste like chocolate? What had made the bacon and eggs taste like chocolate? What had made the toast and butter and marmalade taste like chocolate? Each one of these things had felt the way it had always felt before. The toothpaste had been soft and pasty. The bacon had been hot, crisp, and oily. The toast had been crunchy, and the marmalade sticky and lumpy. But everything had tasted like chocolate. The chocolate he had eaten in bed last night. John put a gloved thumb in his mouth and thoughtfully chewed. His mother had frequently pointed out to him that his chewing his glove made little holes that let in cold air. But he chewed them just the same when he was thinking hard. This time, he noticed something very queer about the thumb of his glove. Instead of tasting leathery, it tasted like chocolate. John pulled his thumb out of his mouth. The part of the glove that had been in his mouth was now brown instead of black like the rest. He bit the end of the leather thumb again. It came right off in his mouth, leaving his own thumb bare. John chewed. It was like chewing leather made of chocolate. Leather that melted like chocolate. In a second or two, he swallowed it. The gloves were not new. John had them quite a while. He couldn't understand why he had never thought of eating them before. He tried to tear off one of the fingers, but the leather was too strong for him. He put it into his mouth and it immediately turned into chocolate. Then he was able to break it off easily. He popped it into his mouth and chewed it up and swallowed it. It was delicious. Walking along, devouring his glove, John did not notice one of his schoolfellows, Spider Wilson, until he heard his voice. "John's gone crazy! John's gone crazy!" Spider yelled. Then he turned to John. "Don't they feed you where you live?" he sneered. Spider was in the grade just above John's and was one of the meanest and slyest boys in the whole school. John gulped down a large piece of the second glove's palm and looked pleased. "What's the matter?" Spider demanded. "Do your people make you eat leather?" "This is special leather," John replied. He licked his lips and sighed contentedly. "It turns into chocolate as soon as you put it in your mouth. Look!" John bit off the glove's little finger and took it out of his mouth. Now it's chocolate. He put it back in his mouth and gulped it down. "Give me a piece," Spider said. "Why should I?" John wanted to know. "They're my gloves." "Hand over a piece," Spider said. "Do I eat your gloves?" John asked reasonably, his mouth full of chocolate. "Why should you eat mine?" "Those aren't real gloves," Spider said. "Whenever one person has candy, he has to share it with others. That's the club rule." "What club?" John asked. "Never mind what club," Spider said. "But you'd better let me have some of that chocolate." Without waiting longer, Spider snatched what was left of the second glove. John was too surprised to resist and didn't want to anyhow. He had a feeling that he had enough chocolate for a while. He was getting a bit thirsty. Spider ran only a little way ahead. When he saw that John wasn't going to fight to get the glove back, he started to eat his prize. He stuffed the leather into his mouth and took a big bite. Spider stopped short in his tracks. He frowned and bit deep into the leather again. Disgusting! It tasted worse than leather. It tasted like leather which a boy had made mud pies and snowballs and patted old dogs. John thought perhaps he might be getting late for school, so he started running. He left Spider Wilson spitting the soggy remains of the glove into the gutter. Still giggling to himself about the defeat of the enemy, John walked between the great stone pillars at the entrance to the school grounds. He had gone no more than halfway to the main building when he heard Susan Buttercup calling him. She was standing near the jungle gym with some of her friends. "I've got something to show you, John," she shouted. As she came running to meet him, she could see that she was waving something in her hand that flashed as it caught the rays of the sun. It was a silver dollar. "It's a birthday present," she explained, showing him the dollar. "Isn't it beautiful?" The sight of such wealth made John forget the triumphs of his own day. "It's a good present," he said. "Are you sure it's made of silver, though? I once got a whole bag of gold coins in a Christmas stocking, only they were chocolate coins covered with gold paper." "Of course it is real, silly," Susan said. "My daddy said so. You can feel it if you don't believe me." She handed him the coin. John looked at the coin suspiciously. "All right," Susan said. "Bite it if you don't think it's real. Go on, bite it." John felt rather silly. "I can see it's real now," he said. "I don't have to bite it." "But I want you to," Susan insisted. "You weren't sure." "We'll make sure. That way, that's what they always do on television. When a cowboy wants to make sure a dollar's real, he bites it." John put the dollar halfway into his mouth and reluctantly bit it. His teeth went right through the coin. The part that had passed between his lips was hard, but sweet chocolate. Susan could hardly believe her eyes. She had given John a complete circle of silver. He sadly handed back a crescent. John didn't know what to say. Susan couldn't speak. Tears trickled down her cheeks like rain down a window pane. She looked at the piece of silver, a dollar in her hand. She looked up at John, whose face was red with embarrassment. "John Midas," Susan blurted out at last, "I hate you." She turned and ran away before John could think of anything to say. Chapter 5. John hung up his coat, got his notebook and pencil out of his locker, and sat down at his small table just in time for the second bell. When Mrs. Plimsoll walked silently into the classroom. As soon as she appeared in the doorway, all the chattering and scuffling stopped. The 20 boys and girls sat straight in their chairs and looked straight ahead at the clean blackboard. "Good morning, children," Miss Plimsoll said. "Good morning, Miss Plimsoll," the class answered respectfully. Miss Plimsoll sat at her high desk, blinking her eyes as she surveyed the room. Then she opened a little drawer in her desk and pulled out a spectacles case, from which she took her reading glasses. She removed her long-distance glasses, put on her short-distance glasses, snapped shut the spectacles case, replaced it in the drawer, shut the drawer, tilted her head forward so that she could look over the glasses on her nose and said, "This morning, children, we are going to have an important test." There were some groans and a few ohs and ahs. Miss Plimsoll lifted up one of her hands in silence and restored instantly. And silence was restored instantly. "No complaining, please," she said sternly. "This test will show me how well you've been learning your arithmetic this year. It will be a short one. I'm going to write just 4 problems on the board. I shall expect you to solve them all swiftly and accurately and to write your answers neatly. You will place your paper in front of you now. You will write the name at the top right-hand corner, and you will place your pencil beside your paper. Sit back on your chair and wait until I give you the signal to begin work. Miss Saul turned to the blackboard and began chalking up the test problems. Tests always made John nervous. Besides, his lips were feeling dry, and the taste of chocolate was strong in his mouth. He raised his hand. Yes, John? Miss Plimsoll asked. Please may I go and get a drink of water, please, Miss Plimsoll? He asked in a small voice. Very well, hurry back. We're going to start in a few minutes. John gratefully slipped out of the room and walked down the quiet corridor to the water fountain. His tongue felt thick with chocolate. The cold water would be refreshing. He pressed his foot down on the fountain treadle, and a stream of clear, ice-cold water spurted up from the river silver nozzle in the white enamel basin. He lowered his head until the jet of water reached his lips. The cold water splashed delightfully against the side of his mouth. He opened his lips. As soon as the water gushed in, it turned into ice-cold chocolate water, thin and sweet. Quickly stopping the flow, John looked with dismay at the shallow puddle that had formed and was now draining away in the basin of the fountain. He hurried to another fountain on the second floor of the building, but there the same thing happened. The clear, ice-cold water turned into liquid chocolate in his mouth. When John finally got back to his classroom, all of the other pupils were bent over their tables, busily scratching away. Miss Plimsoll looked up from her book as John tiptoed in. She looked at the clock at the wall, looked back at him, and wagged her finger reprovingly. John began on the first of the 4 problems, but he was so worried about the chocolate water that he couldn't keep his mind on his work. By the time he was ready to start the 4th problem, the other boys and girls were already putting down their pencils and straightening up and smiling at each other. 2 minutes to go, said Miss Plimsoll. Concentrating hard, John took the end of his pencil between his teeth and began to nibble it. It immediately turned into chocolate. Then he noticed an even more disturbing change. Although he had taken the pencil out of his mouth as soon as the first piece of chocolate had crumbled off, the pencil was continuing to change to chocolate. The chocolate was slowly but steadily moving down the pencil, replacing the wood and the lead inside, changing it into chocolate pencil before John's very eyes. The magic, for John now knew, was his power must be magic, was apparently getting stronger. By the time the whole pencil had changed from red, yellow, and black to dark brown, Miss Plimsoll was announcing that only a few seconds remained to write down the final answers. Just a minute, John pleaded. Shh, Miss Plimsoll cautioned him, holding a finger up to her mouth. Shh, chorused the slow workers, who were becoming almost as excited as John. But John felt worst of all. He felt sure that he could finish the problem and write down the correct answer if only he had something to write with. But Miss Plimsoll, he begged in a loud whisper, my pencil turned into chocolate. Hush, John, Miss Plimsoll said. I'll speak to you after the bell. John tried to write down with his changed pencil, but the point was too soft, and he only succeeded in making a chocolate smear with a number where he should have written 72. Chapter 6. When the others had been excused to go out for mid-morning play, John had to go and stand by Miss Plimsoll's desk. John, Miss Plimsoll said, you mustn't take up silly stories to excuse your failures. I must have the truth. What did you do with your pencil? This is it, John said, showing Miss Plimsoll the pointed stick of chocolate. Really, it is. It's changed. What do you mean it's changed? Miss Plimsoll demanded. That's my pencil, John tried to explain. But it isn't the same anymore. Nothing stays the same today if I put it into my mouth. The same thing happened when I chewed my gloves. They were chocolate too. John, said Miss Plimsoll slowly. Do you feel all right? Yes, thank you, John said. I feel all right, except, he added, I'm getting so thirsty. The water from the water fountain turned into chocolate, and so did the water upstairs. I would like a drink of cold water. Yes, John, Miss Plimsoll said. She suddenly looked pale. You run out and play with the others. I'm going to have a talk with the nurse. And John, Miss Plimsoll said, as he started toward the classroom door, here's another pencil. Be a good boy and try not to lose it. I'm afraid I'll have to keep this piece of chocolate until school's out. You know we don't allow to eat candy in class. Miss Plimsoll put the slightly chewed chocolate pencil in her desk drawer, and John went out to look for Susan. He found her skipping rope with 2 girls in his class. John usually scorned skipping rope. He preferred hide and seek, tag, FBI and spies, kick the can, or any other good, exciting game. Jumping rope up and down in one place was just to avoid being hit by a rope. Seemed silly to him, but he was sorry for having spoiled Susan's silver dollar and was willing to make a sacrifice. Susan, he said. Susan continued to bounce on one foot as her 2 friends swung the rope over and under, over and under, over and under her. She didn't seem to notice John. I'll skip with you, he offered. Susan stopped, and the rope was caught by her shins. Let's try doubles backwards, she said, but not to John. She ignored John. You go first, Betty. Ellen, you go second. I'll go last. The one who does it the most times gets the first slice of my birthday cake. Susan looked at John, raised her eyebrows, shut her eyes, and stuck out the tip of her pink tongue. Then she turned back to the girls and smiled. Ellen whispered in Betty's ear, and Betty whispered in Susan's ear. And then all 3 of them looked at John and at each other again and burst out laughing. Oh, Susan, John protested. I didn't mean to do it. The trouble is there's something magic about me today. Everything I put in my mouth turns into chocolate. The girls giggled. You wouldn't like it, said John, who was beginning to feel sorrier for himself than he had felt before. I think it's getting worse, he said reproachfully. At first, just the part in my mouth turned to chocolate. But when I nibbled the end of my pencil, the whole pencil changed. Pooh, Susan said. The others hooted with glee. Maybe I'll just get sick and die, John warned. Maybe I'll turn to chocolate myself. Then you'll be sorry. I don't believe one word about the chocolate, Susan said. And if it was true, you'd be glad, because all you ever like eating is chocolate. If you don't believe me, John retorted, just give me that skipping rope and I'll prove it. The girls looked questionably at each other for an instant. But they hesitated. As they hesitated, the bell rang and it was time to go back in the classroom. The rest of the morning passed slowly for John. He was afraid that his mother was going to be cross about the missing gloves. She might not accept the excuse that he had eaten them. He regretted his messed up arithmetic test. He was sad about Susan's anger and disbelief and was getting terribly thirsty. Once during geography and once during art, he was excused to get a drink of water. Both times, however, he swallowed nothing but sweet chocolate. His mouth was getting stickier and sweeter and drier by the minute. That brings us to chapter 7. So today we finished chapters 4, 5, and 6. So now it's time to show what you know and what you learned. You are allowed to go back to the story to find your answers for the assignments on Google Classroom. You can also use Google, a dictionary, or even Alexa to help you get your answers when you define some of the brand new vocabulary words that were in these chapters. Okay, now let me just stop recording.